It's actually easier to illustrate some of these ideas with a specific example. So I'm going to talk about a meta-analysis of studies in the climate conflict literature, which is a very interdisciplinary literature. So maybe we'll touch, on the interests of many people in this room. There's this long tradition of studying this specific question of how climate or natural resources and the environment more broadly affect violent human conflict. These sorts of ideas go back centuries. People have been talking about them for a long time. And what's been new, relatively new, is in the last decade, there's a growing quantitative literature to understand how things like droughts or floods or high temperatures or basically extreme climatic conditions affect human societies, and in particular violence in human societies. The goal of this meta-analysis that Saul Shang, Marshall Burke, and I worked on was to try to understand, is there a coherent message that comes out of this literature? Now that there's all these studies, can we say anything meaningful if we take all the studies together? As we sort of dove into this literature, and we were really interested in the big picture question, we were trying to find out discover all the studies we could. There were different time frames, they were using different data sets, there were lots of different methods. And I think it's interesting making the contrast with the minimum wage literature. The minimum wage literature, let's say focused on the US or rich countries for the most part, you kind of know what the outcome is. It's going to be like some measure of unemployment. Explanatory variable is going to be like the minimum wage. There's some basic stuff that's set. This literature, in some ways, was much less well-defined. There's temperature studies that look at high temperature. There's studies that look at extreme rainfall. There's studies that look at El Nino, this big weather phenomenon. Okay, how do we kind of put these together? And then there's different outcomes. There's many forms of conflict. There's civil war. There's violent crime. There's all kinds of studies that are in this broad umbrella of, violent human conflict. We had to make a decision about what sorts of approaches we found credible and which ones we didn't. So, for instance, the studies that have longitudinal data but don't include location, fixed effects, or time controls at all, we felt like that's not the appropriate way to use longitudinal data. So we made a decision, and we said, you know what? We're going to impose a certain methodological standard. If you can justify it, if you can really make the case that methodologically there's an appropriate approach to analyzing the data, which we try to do in this paper, it helps you sort of undo some of the specification searching and data mining that might have existed in some of the original studies. Okay, so there were three types of studies, some of which we're able to sort of combine more easily than others in our analysis. There are these long-term historical studies. We do not include these in the meta-analysis. Like, the data is really different. They're for a totally different time period. These are studies that use things like tree rings or sediment deposits. The second set of studies were laboratory studies. These were really fun. There's lab experiments where police trainees are much more violent in a hot training room than a cool training room. And then there's some other really awful experiments where psychologists in Arizona on hot days in the summertime just wouldn't move at green lights. And they basically just recorded how crazy people in the cars behind them went. And they went nuts on hot days. But on cool days, they only went kind of nuts. Okay, the main literature we focus on are observational studies with longitudinal data or panel data. There's this very natural distinction between interpersonal studies, interpersonal violence, like crime, violent crime, person to person, and organized violence or intergroup violence. So like a civil war is a different outcome than violent assault or murder. But we felt like the interpersonal studies had some commonality, like assault and murder and whatnot had much more in common with each other. And things like civil war, insurgency, conflict, even rioting, they were more common to each other. Now, there's some in the middle. Maybe rioting's in the middle. Maybe there's others that are hard to classify. But we made this distinction. There's also some differences in the population studied. Most of the intergroup violence studies are poor country studies. They're like civil war in Africa, Hindu-Muslim rioting in India, things like that. And most of the interpersonal violence with this like really good, high-quality, high-frequency data is from rich countries. So they just felt like two different sets of studies, and that's how we divided them up. But you might disagree with that. You might want to pool them. You might also want to divide these even more. So these are the kinds of debates that are always going to ensue when you start combining literatures. What we put together here is some sense of where these studies fall. Like, what do they look like? So the left panel here is the time period of the study in a kind of reverse log scale. Tons of data go back to the post-war period, basically. That's where you see a lot of data. A lot of the studies are basically post-war period. But then there's a bunch of these historical studies that go way back. The right-hand panel here shows the scales, geographic scales and time scales. A ton of these really are country year observations. A bunch of these are, province year, pixel year, municipality year. There's just a lot of massive studies that get annual data at the national or subnational data and try to look for relationships. There's also a fair number of studies, and these are more of the longer-term studies, again, that go way out to the centuries or whatnot. These are the tree ring studies or the sediment deposits at the national scale. But, there's some variability. Like this Vrie et al. Study was the lab experiment. So some of these are just literally variation at the hourly level, and then some are global. This is a global El Nino study by Saul as well. So there's a lot of range in terms of the types of studies. And we started finding all these patterns. Like 24 of these studies focus on temperature as the key climate variable. In 24 out of 24, higher temperature, the point estimate's positive. Higher temperature is associated with more violence. We're like, okay, that seems pretty unlikely to happen by chance. In the precipitation studies, not all of them, but almost all of them give this result that more extreme precipitation is associated with more violence. Okay, that seems to go in the right direction. 3/4 of the individual studies are statistically significant. So again, the bulk of the evidence seems to point towards extreme climate leading to more conflict. One of the figures we put together early on, this is using African data, is just to say that whether we look at villages, this is a study looking across Tanzanian villages, we look at the pixel level in East Africa, and actually this exact area is that pixel, so we line those up. If we go from the pixel level to all of Africa, and then we go up to the globe, you basically see this upward sloping relationship. More extreme climate, more conflict. So these were just a few of the studies, but there's just dozens of these. So in the paper, we have all these plots, and we say, we're going to look across all these estimates. This is before the meta-analysis. This is what we did before the meta-analysis. We said, look at the data. More extreme temperature moving to the right. More conflict. That holds for, this one up here is violent crime in the U.S. in the top left. This is rape in the U.S. This is retaliation in baseball games on hot days. This is Hindu-Muslim rioting in India, etc. So pretty much almost all of them, you see this upward sloping relationship. This may seem kind of compelling, but we may want more than pictures, even these beautiful pictures that Saul put together. What is the average effect? Give me a number. I'm working for the UN. I'm trying to plan for climate change. It's going to warm by 2 degrees Celsius, maybe 3 degrees Celsius. Give me a number. How much will violence increase? We couldn't do that just from the pictures. We need to combine these estimates in a more systematic way. How much uncertainty is there? So you have a bunch of pictures, but maybe the standard errors are really big, and maybe we shouldn't have much confidence in these results. We want to understand uncertainty. We may want to quantify heterogeneity or understand the source of heterogeneity. That was sort of like some of the comments before. Maybe we can do better than just looking at pictures. We can do things systematically. And then we wanted to look at publication bias. So we wanted to get back to this initial question in the literature. Is there so much publication bias that we just don't believe the literature fundamentally? So yes, we can come up with a meta-analysis estimate. But if we think the whole literature is riddled with publication bias, maybe we don't put much weight on it. So this was really the goal of the next step, is to take all those estimates and build something that's a little firmer. Okay, first thing, to combine estimates across studies, we need to have comparable units. This was a big challenge in the climate and conflict literature. No one that we knew of had come up with a way to standardize measures. There's actually a straightforward way to do it, which is what we ended up doing. We consider all the climate shocks as deviations from the local mean. And we just put them in standard deviation units. We say, hey, if you're a degree Celsius warmer in tropical Africa, that's 1.5 standard deviations. Maybe it's only 1 standard deviation in India. But we're going to basically use the local distribution as the relevant measure of shocks. Now, that is the relevant measure of the shocks that populations face there. You might complain and say, well, that means you're sort of studying small temperature shocks in Africa and large temperature shocks in the northern latitudes. So you might say, well, maybe you're really not comparing apples to apples anymore. So, you can do all this analysis for temperature, and we have done, some of this. But this is actually a very natural thing to consider. Maybe in the long run, you really get adapted to your local distribution of climate shocks, and a 2 standard deviation shock that's meaningful for you yeah, that temperature variation may not be meaningful for others. But anyway, this provided a very simple standardization of the climate variables. Second, we then represent, or we display, the effects as percentage changes with respect to the local mean of the outcome variable. So now all of a sudden, instead of saying, a temperature shock of 1 degree increases civil war by 8 percentage points and rainfall in India does something else, we can say a 1 standard deviation climate shock affects this conflict outcome by 12%. And we have that sort of potential for comparability. And I would say that even if it's imperfect, at least it allows for some comparability, some ability to compare.